Hello and welcome wherever you are to this session of the 30th Orkney International Science Festival. It sounds like a story from a film. A lost civilization living on a mountain in South America, protected from centuries of European conquest by its remoteness, and then deciding one day to break their silence and come down from the mountain and to bring with them a warning to the whole world. Change your ways with the environment, they say, for the consequences are starting to threaten the stability of the planet. And the words are spoken with authority from a civilization that is very old and speaks of us as the younger brother. It's like a film, but it's reality. The people are the Kogi, high in Colombia's Sierra Nevada, and they have set out their message very clearly in 2 films. For these, they enlisted a filmmaker with a lifetime's experience, which has included awards for television documentaries on the Somme and the Spanish Armada, and collaborations on series such as Crusades and Terry Jones's Medieval Lives, for which he has also written one of various books. His name is Alan Ereira, and he's with me this evening to set the scene and to join the subsequent discussion with marine ecologist Professor Alex Rogers, who we will speak with in more detail later on. So over to you, Alan, and welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, and what an honor it is to be here, and how pleasant, how good it is to see both of you again. It's a delight. Now, hopefully, I can get this to share the screens in the correct way. So if we're lucky, you are now looking at, are you looking at the right screen? What do you think? Probably. So I will assume that you are, and I will continue. Assuming I can get this to move at all. Here we go. Right. So, as Howie has said, the Kogi people of Colombia have preserved their culture and their way of life from invasion, conquest, and the cultural erosion of trade, missionaries, and state power for over 500 years. For most of that time, they were hidden. They live in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, which is a steep, difficult, and lawless mountain rising over 5 kilometers directly out of the Caribbean. The mountain's a triangular pyramid, geologically separate from South America. It rises steeply from the tropics to glaciers, with desert, forest, and verdant hidden valleys. The Kogi call it the heart of the world. This was where the Spanish first made landfall on the continent. They found a highly developed civilization with large cities connected by a dense network of paths and staircases, and they called the people here Tairona. They also found some of the most astonishing gold work of the Americas. To their dismay, it turned out to be heavily alloyed with copper, and only on the surface was the copper dissolved away to leave shining gold. How the Tairona did that is still a mystery, like so much of what they did. What they did, and assure me they still do, is to sustain the life of the mountain. Since the mountain is a microcosm of the world, they believe that they are acting as the guardians of all life on Earth. That is why they believe they're acting there. That is why the Kogi, who are descended from the Tairona, had to survive, hiding from us, who they call their younger brothers, ignorant destroyers. The Kogi believe that if they're unable to perform their work, the mountain will die, and so will everything else. I first met them 30 years ago when they were looking for a safe way of communicating with us. They were aware that the scale of our damage to the world had outstripped their ability to hold nature in balance, and warning us was the only way left to them, despite the risks from revealing themselves. This was my crossing point, a bridge over a ravine. They have no writing, no electricity, no roads, no wheel. I offered them access to the BBC through a machine, an eye that remembers and an ear that remembers, and they took the risk. They wanted to teach us to understand the mountain and the entire world as a single living body, of which we are part. It lives, it's sentient, it is conscious, and they work in communication with it. Everything is connected. If you cut off a foot, they say, you know the rest of the body suffers, is damaged, is changed. It's the same if you dry up an estuary. Everything on the mountain, they insist, is connected, and they've now learned to map those connections in a way that makes sense to us. Here, the threads are shown. Some of them are physically manifest in surface water flows. Some are underground flows and the paths of winds and clouds. Some are revealed in the movements of animals and birds. Some are trains of thought, connections only graspable by people specially trained from birth, raised for 18 years in the dark. These people are called mamas. Mama means the sun. We might say enlightened? This mama has spent his entire life at a single spot on the mountain, an access point for communicating with the earth. When the government decided to build a road between the mountain and the sea, the indigenous were horror-struck. They sent messages explaining that this would cut all the threads along the coast. Naturally, this was treated as a primitive superstition. The consequences became manifest on a truly shocking scale. The whole coast, the interchange in our terms between the fresh waters of the mountain rivers and the sea of nutrients that is the warm Caribbean, had been shrouded in dense mangrove swamps. Now the threads were all cut. The interchange stopped. One of the world's largest mangrove forests became an immense graveyard of wooden stumps. The communities that lived here were ruined. The fish and shellfish have gone. By the time younger brother grasped what had happened when you cut off a foot, it was too late. Now the government are trying to solve the problem by building a prosthetic. Desperate to demonstrate that their knowledge is pragmatic and scientific, the Kogi asked me to help them make a film that engaged top-flight Western scientists. And Alex Rogers, who wonderfully is here, was one of 3 who took part. Some of you may have seen the film Aluna and know what happened. Aluna means consciousness. The Kogi mamas work with the network of living threads that make up the structure, and that work is in effect a form of acupuncture. They mapped the points that connect the shore and the massif. Action at the higher spots has a direct effect on the connected lower ones and vice versa. This is one of those earth acupuncture points. It's an izwama, the word they use for a place of organization, like a government office. It actually means unique hotspot. The effects of our disruption are not just environmental. Human society is part of the living world, and making trees sick also makes us sick. That road along the shore, the Troncal, is a highway now fought over by paramilitaries and cocaine lords, a source of constant social infection. And in both of their 2 films with me, they were very clear about what we could expect if we continue tearing up the fabric of life itself. New illnesses will appear. There will be no cure or remedy for them, unquote. They insisted that was not a prophecy, any more than predicting an eclipse is a prophecy, or knowing that night follows day. In addition to the arrival of the pandemic, the mountains' rivers are now dry. The rainforest has no rain. The glaciers are melted. The great city of Santa Marta at the mountain's foot, the oldest colonial city in the so-called New World, has all its water brought in by truck now, and the sewage system has collapsed. The Kogi point to settlers clearing the land for recreational homes and felling specific trees, like this fallen giant, which sustained the springs in the forest. My organization, the Tairona Heritage Trust, has now teamed up with a local foundation restoring the dry forest to work under the supervision of Kogi mamas to bring one river valley back to life. We call it Resurrecting Water, and are working with the UNESCO project Bridges, which aims to bridge different ways of understanding the world to produce a useful model of sustainable science. And just before I finish, I have a question that someone listening to this might be able to answer. A large part of the Kogi's warning has been about gold. The Tairona took gold from rivers. Indigenous Americans never mined gold before the conquest. The Kogi are very insistent that mining gold is a fundamental attack on the world's fertility and ability to sustain life. They first told me this in 1990, and I could make no sense of it. Since then, gold mining has run riot. We have taken more gold out of the ground in the 30 years since I made that film than in our entire previous history added together. This is a Colombian river destroyed and poisoned by illegal gold mining. $8 billion a year is extracted by mechanical mines in Colombia alone, replacing cocaine as a business and run, of course, by the same people. I want to understand what the Kogi are talking about. What does extracting gold do? And is there a connection to what is happening to life now on Earth? Thank you for listening.
Alan, that is fascinating and also extremely disturbing. There is much to ask you about. And first of all, we'll now bring in Professor Alex Rogers, who's a marine ecologist specializing in deep sea and Antarctic ecology, as well as coral reef ecosystems. He's led the British Antarctic Survey's biodiversity programme, carried out numerous projects for international agencies, holds a chair in conservation at Oxford University, and currently works for REV Ocean, a not-for-profit company created in Norway with the single purpose to make the ocean healthy again. Alex, welcome.
Good evening. Thanks, Howie.
And I'd like to start by asking you how you became involved with the Kogi. Alan mentioned it briefly, and if you could expand on that.
Yes, it was quite a surprise, actually. I'd launched a report for an organisation called the International Programme on the State of the Ocean, on essentially the state of the ocean. And the report, as you can imagine, made for fairly grim reading. It was picked up by MPs in the UK, and we presented it at the UN as well at an informal meeting. And following the visit to New York to launch the report, I received a communication from Alan, which was rather mysterious, asking if I wanted to come to Colombia and meet this group of indigenous people, the Kogi. And Alan said that essentially they had ideas about how to organize their lives and their communities in a way that was highly sustainable in terms of the surrounding ecosystem. And Alan was intrigued to know whether the methods they used had any parallels in terms of modern science.
And what did you find?
Well, what I found was absolutely intriguing. Modern science, or the modern scientific method, the Western method, has had huge successes, but it's a highly reductionist method in terms of as far as scientific methods go. So it's really struggled with dealing with the complexity of ecosystems and how to deal with and acquire knowledge to manage ecosystems. Yet here was a lost group of indigenous people who seem to have taken a very holistic approach to managing the landscape in which they were embedded, and they could really achieve apparent miracles in terms of restoring the land and preserving its function and biodiversity. And indeed, one of the things which really struck me when I met the Kogi was that day we went to visit the dead mangrove forest along the coast. And I couldn't speak the language. It's an incredibly complex language that the Kogi speak, not simply in terms of the words, but even the philosophy and the concepts behind the language are completely different to a Western language. But the Mama Shibalata explained to me in sign language that the river or the land was like a woman's body, and what the building of the road had done was to cut the woman's body at around the level of the stomach, effectively cutting the flow of fluid from her head, which was lying in her feet, which were in the oceans. And this was an enormously powerful way of describing actually what had happened, because what had happened was the road had blocked the flow of fresh water into the mangrove forest, And in the heat of the tropics, once that fresh water was cut, then evaporation causes the mud and the overlying water to go hypersaline, and the salt basically killed the forest. So the analogy used by the Kogi was in fact scientifically extremely accurate.
And what happened? What did you go on to do after that?
Well, in terms of general life, or or
in terms of the collaboration with them, the investigation of the pictures of the world that they were conveying.
Yeah, well, it was really Alan who then put together the film, and me and a number of other scientists spoke about the parallels between Kogi knowledge and scientific knowledge. And I'll give you another really great example, and that was the Kogi had special places for almost all their animals and their plants. So you would go to an area and the mum would say, this is the place of the parrot. And in times past, they would bury these golden statues of the animal in that place, which unfortunately has meant that many of them have been plundered. But it was clear that they held these places more or less as sacred for that particular organism. And in fact, what they had been doing was creating refugia for a particular species. And we know that models, modern ecological theory, have told us that a system where you have dispersed refugia with exploitation going on in between is a very resilient system that allows a high level of productivity for the land, but minimizes the chances of extinction of the species upon which you're relying.
So really, coming from a Western scientific background, you found the language that they were talking a language in which you could feel something in common.
Absolutely. And in fact, bizarrely, since that time, and I've struggled to remember exactly what year it was, it's probably a good 10 years ago when we did this. Since that time, actually in modern scientific terms, we've started to realize that in fact humans are completely embedded in the ecology of the planet. And the Kogi knew this, I would say instinctively, but actually, obviously, the way they would have evolved this knowledge was through, hundreds or thousands of years of observation of how the ecosystem, the land responded to the things that they were doing. So it was this traditional knowledge that they'd gathered over generations and generations, which is in their culture. As Alan said, Aluna is a kind of description of mind. Another way I've heard of it being described is the mind of nature. And it's this idea that, in fact, nature is conscious and we are connected with it in the same way that all animals, plants, and microorganisms and everything else is connected. Modern science is now moving towards this realization. We certainly had the first inklings of this through James Lovelock's Gaia theory, but now unfortunately, with the growing impacts of climate change, we really are starting to see this idea coming to fruition in terms of our deep connection with nature. We are affected by the natural world, and what we do affects it.
Could I ask a direct scientific question about the nature of science? Do you think, in fact, that the success of physics and chemistry over a period of time has led to a kind of fragmented picture of life for biology, and that maybe the message of ecology, which is the interconnectedness of things, is the direction that science needs to go in?
I think there's no doubt about that, actually. I think that the reductionist approach of Western science has really created an uphill struggle for science to deal with some of the multifaceted problems we are now faced by in society in terms of living in a sustainable way on planet Earth. And it's not just the Kogi in terms of indigenous people that have acquired this knowledge. If you go to Hawaii, there's a management system called Ahupua'a, if that's the correct pronunciation, where they also manage the environment in a very holistic way, all the way, in fact, from the mountains right down to the reefs around the islands. And the parallels with the Kogi ideas about managing the landscape are just really quite staggering.
Well, while we've been speaking, the questions have been coming in, so we'll bring back Alan in now as well. And the first question is really possibly for you, first of all, Alan. Are the Kogi especially vulnerable to diseases and viruses, bearing in mind what's happening now?
At the moment, the Kogi are in retreat. They have resumed their many hundred-year-old policy of staying completely out of contact with the rest of us. And we don't really know what's going on. The only thing that we have really received from them is a request for communication equipment, which we are hoping to fulfill with satellite communications kit in 4 or 5 locations. But the Kogi are, of course, they are tremendously vulnerable, as are all indigenous people in areas where there is no hospital care available. There's a political leader died 3 weeks ago, having been helicoptered out. The Kogi themselves are not convinced he died of COVID, though it does appear to the rest of us that he had the symptoms of COVID. But actually, we don't know what's going on, and we wait with bated and horrified breath to find out.
There's another question, mainly I think for you, Alan, about a concept of time. How do they think of time? Are they like our cultures with time pressing on them with a sense of urgency, or do they look at it in a different way?
I've never been able to grasp their sense of time at all. I did spend quite a long time asking them simple questions like how many months are there in a year? And the answers were invariably incomprehensible. So I don't know how they see time is organized. They have a kind of a cosmic sense of the grand epoch. So there is a scale of time in which the universe goes through many shape-shifting experiences, of which this is one. But whether, I don't know, there are many strains of thought in Kogi world as there are in every other world. Some are millennials, some are not, and so on.
Now, a question for you both. The Kogi asked Alan to make a film with a warning to the world 30 years ago, then a second film around 8 years ago because they felt the warning wasn't getting through. Is the warning now getting through? Is there any difference, or have we not moved far in 30 years? Alex, to you first.
Personally, I don't think we've moved far enough. In fact, not even fractionally far enough. And I think the reason for that is that people are still under the misapprehension that nature is kind of benevolent, or that we can think or technology our way out of the crisis which is rapidly looming, not just in terms of climate change, but also our other activities which are directly destroying nature. If you look at what's going on on the west coast of the US at the moment, in terms of the wildfires, the area burnt by wildfires in that region has doubled since 1970. It will double again by 2050. We know that we're looking at far higher levels of sea level rise far more quickly than has previously been acknowledged. And And, there are many other natural phenomena which are going to cause the humankind, as well as, animal and plant kind, enormous suffering and huge loss. So the powerful governments around the world are taking this nowhere near seriously enough. And in terms of climate impacts, for example, all that we've seen so far has happened with 1 degree C of warming. Under the current Paris Agreement, we've dialed in somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees C of warming by the end of the century. And that will create a planet completely unlike the one that we've evolved upon.
Alan, optimistic or pessimistic? What's the view for your view and for the Kogi?
My view is a complete irrelevance. I know nothing at all. Alex is an expert. The Kogi are experts. I'm simply a newspaper reader. And I read a very interesting article today by a chap called Lamont, who said that climate change, man-made climate change, is a complete illusion and a fraud, which tells you where we are at as far as I can see. Major newspaper. The Kogi's perspective has never changed, which is it's never too late. When they made the last film, my original presentation of it to them ended on a very, very downbeat note. And they said, very good film, but now you've got to come back and remake the ending, because if we thought that we're faced with inevitable disaster, why would we bother to do any of this? That's not what's happening. And so they refuse to accept that we cannot do anything.
Now that ending, oh, sorry, Alex, you come in. Yes.
Yeah, I must say, I do agree with that, that Kogi sentiment on that. There is always time to do something, and I would far rather have 2 degrees of warming than 6 degrees of warming by 2100. So there is huge need for us to take action. And I'd just say about Lamont's article that Alan's read, I mean, if you look at the weight of scientific evidence now that climate change is taking place and is man-made, I mean, we're probably looking at 99% of scientific papers being of that view. So actually taking Lamont's view is like playing Russian roulette with a loaded gun and, putting your faith in the fact that somehow that gun's going to malfunction. It's madness.
That's the problem.
I just wanted to bring Alan back because that ending of the second film was rather wonderful, with you all going into the river, and you made the point that it was their idea. So they did they very much shape, well, both films, but the second film in particular?
They completely shaped both films. There is no scene in either film that was not under their complete control. So the first film, which looks like a very anthropological film, every single person that appears in a village during that film is in that village because they've been told to be in that village. The whole thing was their presentation of themselves, a very conscious presentation of themselves. It is not artless. They are not an artless people. And the second film is the same thing. It is a very highly thought through structure in which everything is the way they want to be seen and understood. And their change at the end of the film, actually, the first time they have ever not told me the truth. They said, you come back, you bring back your film crew, we will shoot a new ending, and we will go into the river. The Western younger brother mama and our mama will go into the river together at the end for a renewal. And don't worry, everybody will be fully dressed. That was a lie.
It's a wonderful ending, and the two wonderful films, which are both on YouTube, and they both have links from our program entry page for this. And now a question's come in. It's really for you both, from Bill Graham in Murray, who asks, Is the Kogi point of view just philosophical, or do they have a scientific understanding that has eluded us, or perhaps just something that we have ignored? If I put it to Alex first.
I don't think there's any doubt at all that their way of life and the way they manage things is done in a scientific way, or at least with the outcomes that you would expect in terms of a really good scientific approach to managing an ecosystem, to manage it sustainably, preserve biodiversity and ecosystem function. But what you've got to bear in mind is that traditional knowledge is transmitted in very different ways to Western science. The way we communicate science is through scientific papers and scientific meetings, whereas the Kogi and other indigenous people really embed this knowledge in their culture, and that's the way it's transmitted down generations. So the way that's done would be through tradition, it's through storytelling, it may be through referring to, you know, animals as spirits, as parts of nature and so on. But this is really just a very different way of communicating scientific knowledge. That doesn't mean that the outcome and really even the approaches they're using in terms of their land management are non-scientific.
I'd like to just add one thing which is worrying me at the moment, because I described an experiment that's going on in order to bring Kogi knowledge into a validation system with Western knowledge. And you talked, Alex, about the problem of a reductionist approach. And actually that invalidates experiments, because in order to demonstrate the success or failure of a program to bring water back into a particular spot, ideally, the science would expect you to compare it with another place where things were done differently, so that you could compare two different approaches and see how they, what the comparison was. However, in the Kogi philosophy, in which all nature is a single collected entity, that can't possibly mean anything, because there is no such thing as one place that is separated from another. And therefore, there is no other place for this experiment to be compared with. And that is going to create a problem for us in defining an experimental process that can achieve scientific recognition in publication. I'd very much appreciate assistance in guidance through that, Alex, if you're interested in getting involved.
Yes, yeah, I certainly would be. But actually, this is not a problem just in terms of the Kogi way of thinking. This is also a problem in terms of modern science at those sorts of scales. And this is where Western science runs into real problems. Science, what you're describing, Alan, is replication. And geographic proximity means that even if you did take two adjacent valleys and treated them in the same or different ways, their very geographic proximity might mean that that's actually influencing the results. But I think that Western science has more problems in terms of its general approach, which is really focused on the kind of nuts and bolts without looking at the whole machine. And that's a real issue when you come to thinking about what's going on, at the whole landscape level, and winding up even to the entire region and the relationships between the living land and surrounding weather patterns and everything else. And we are making some breakthroughs on that in terms of Western science, but it's a real uphill struggle.
I've been writing a little bit and talking a little bit about we need to abandon the concept of edges in the real world. Things do not have edges, and thinking that they do leads to massive falsifications.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And the other big problem with Western science is the separation of the observer from the experiment. And that also leads to a philosophical problem again of humans somehow being separated from nature and the consequences of their actions. As Mr. Lamont would find out if he's around by the end of this century. But in fact, really, if he looks hard enough, he can see the impacts of that already. I mean, we've already had situations where people have literally been dying because the temperatures have got so high and the body just can't cope with it in certain parts of the world.
And Alan, what's the next step? One of the questions that came in just now is, are the Kogi reliant solely on the likes of yourselves to advocate for them, or are there any other ways that the message is getting through? And what's really the next step?
It's difficult. They've written a book explaining their landscape management to some extent. It goes into considerable depth, but not enough depth, and it's never been translated out of Spanish. They're a bit nervous about it, but it is an absolutely astonishing work. And that drawing of the network over the mountain, all the connected threads, is an illustration in that book. They've also done analyses of the river valleys to show where all the connected points are in a single river valley. It's very important work. And I'm hoping that we can find some way of getting it out and that we can find publication, because that is one route, isn't it, through publication. Another route, I suppose, is through protest and public awareness, but it's very difficult locally. More importantly, perhaps, we're trying through this water project to engage local communities in looking after their own territory better. Because the reason why Santa Marta has run out of water is not actually climate change. It is the disastrous management of the water by the people in the locality who have no understanding of what they're doing.
Yes, yeah. And I wanted to ask, well, you both a question. It's fascinating how young people are brought up for a period to be mammoths. I think you said, was it 9 years or longer in darkness? That's a really strange way. And I just wondered what effect that has on them.
Well, I don't know that there's been much in the way of psychological testing. My experience is that the mamas come out. Well, I love the story of one of my favorite, Mama Manuel, who played a significant role in Aluna. When at the end of his 18 years, he came out into the light. He was completely petrified, turned around, ran back into the dark and curled up in a ball for 2 days, which is an entirely respectable thing to do, in my opinion. We do well to only just do it for 2 days. It's completely disorienting, and you never recover from it. They are what they're learning all the time throughout their entire upbringing is empathy. That's what it's all about. Empathy, not just with human beings, empathy with the cosmic level of empathy. And therefore they are real treasures in their communities because they know how to behave with people and how to look after people, and the way in which they handle, for example, dispute and confrontation is astonishing, and we could learn a tremendous amount from it. I'm not sure that their eyesight is very good. Spending that long in the dark probably doesn't do your eyesight a great deal of good. But they're not, I wouldn't have said that they were psychologically damaged by the experience.
And Alex, you're used obviously in academia to assessing people as intelligent, sensitive, thoughtful. What kind of impressions did you form?
Well, I think the Kogi mamas are clearly the kind of receptacle of knowledge passed down through generations in the Kogi groups or tribes. But you've got to look at them in the context of the broader community, and everything that's done within the community is for the community. So if, for example, they go to harvest something, they simply wouldn't understand the Western concept of, I'm going to go and dig my potatoes, stick in my garage and store for me to use. They would be harvesting them for the entire village. The same thing even goes as far as, if they lose a child, for example, it's not my child that's been lost. It is, the children of the village have been lost. So there's a completely different approach to living with each other than the very competitive and sort of throat-cutting Western way of life, I think, in many ways. And the Mamas are intimately connected with that approach to living with each other.
And one more question to you both. Again, that film, Aluna the Movie, the second film, seemed to me watching it that the first one was directed to us all, but the second one seemed particularly focused on science, wanting science to change. Alan, was that something that came through to you?
It was the whole purpose. It was the object. One of their conclusions was that the reason they were not taken seriously was because people thought that they were mystics, that their knowledge was obscure and obscurantist. And what they wanted us to recognize was that their knowledge is pragmatic, that it is not fantastical, it is not mystical, it is, well, as I said in my little presentation, being able to say that the pandemic was coming was no more a prophecy than saying that an eclipse is going to happen. It's knowledge, it's real understanding. And they wanted to have people like Alex come along and listen to them and say, actually, your way of thinking is not very different from my way of thinking. I don't think you're a mystic. I think you know what's going on.
Alex?
Yeah, I think that's very true. And in fact, if you look at indigenous knowledge globally, this has often been the attitude of governments and so on towards their indigenous people. That in fact they're talking a load of hocus pocus, and their traditional knowledge doesn't have any context or meaning in the real world. But we've been shown time and time again that what is, I guess, communicated as, things being sacred or things being taboo. And I'll give you a fabulous example, I think, which is fig trees. In many parts of the old world, indigenous people treat fig trees as indigenous. Not as indigenous, as sacred. And in fact, modern science has discovered that, in fact, these trees are keystone species. They're incredibly important in terms of the life history of many birds, primates, and other animals. So, that idea of them being sacred, in fact, fits very well with scientific ideas about, certain species are extremely important within ecosystems because they have many connections to other species within that system. And in fact, that comes back again to the Kogi idea of this connectivity of everything in nature, including themselves.
And we took care in that film to avoid the word sacred as much as possible, because it's a word that leads to the impression that this isn't knowledge that you need to take any notice of. It's simply people's beliefs. And so we wanted to avoid that.
This has been a fascinating discussion. It's time now to round off and to, first of all, thank our two speakers, Alan and Alex, for so many insights, to thank the technical team who worked so hard behind the scenes to make everything run smoothly, to you, the viewers, for sharing the time with us and sending in such interesting questions. If you want to continue discussing various topics, whatever you feel like discussing, well, there's a chance to meet more festival goers and do just that. There are spaces available at tables in the festival club, which we've been hearing, in fact, is a place for lively discussion and good company. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, we move to the frontiers of physics with a look at superconductivity and quantum computing. Until then, goodbye for now.
Thank you, Howie. Thank you.
Thank you, Howie.